Watching the news in English is a great way to improve your English, but they often use some very difficult vocabulary words, some idioms, some English phrasal verbs. So today we are going to watch a news clip. I have slowed it down a little bit. I have put subtitles on the screen. And after we watch it together, I will come back and explain the most difficult terms that they use. A couple days ago, I made an English lesson about the Democratic National Convention. And in that lesson, I mentioned how there were protests, but they weren't violent. Well, that changed yesterday. They did get violent. Property was damaged. Thankfully, nobody was seriously injured, but the convention still has 2 days left, so I'm hoping we don't see any more violence today. Let's take a look at the first clip.
Some of the most tense exchanges so far. That fence behind me that was breached, not just already fixed, but crews this morning adding an additional layer of fencing as Chicago prepares for what is expected to be another round of protests.
In that clip, the reporter mentioned tense exchanges. What does that mean? For each term, I am going to have a simple definition and I will use that term in a sentence. So, tense exchanges means conversations or arguments where people feel angry or upset. There were tense exchanges between protesters and police when the protesters refused to leave. Breached. We have a couple definitions of breached, but let's just focus on the one they used in the news clip. That means force your way through or broke a barrier or a rule. So you could see in the news clip that protesters breached that fence. They got over that fence. They broke it a little bit. Here's a sentence. Some protesters breached the police barriers and tried to get closer to the DNC venue. I've also used the term conference center. Venue, conference center, in this case, they're the same thing.
Some of the most tense exchanges so far. That fence behind me that was breached, not just already fixed, but crews this morning adding an additional layer of fencing as Chicago prepares for what is expected to be another round of protests.
The reporter mentioned another round of protests. That can be difficult because we have a couple different ways we use round in English. This first one, if you look at the picture, that shape is a circle, and we could describe that as being round. Let's take a look at the definition. Something shaped like a circle. The protesters formed a round circle to block the entrance to the convention center. But that is not the way the reporter used it. He talked about another round of protests. So what does that mean? A single part of a fight or contest, often with breaks in between. If you look at that picture, let me make it a little bigger for you. That sport is boxing in English. If you have ever watched a boxing match, you know the fighters will fight for about 3 minutes and then they will take a break. That is a round of boxing. With 2 more days to go in the convention, we might see a few more rounds of protests. Take a look at a sentence. After a heated round of shouting, the police called for backup to control the crowd. Backup. That means more police officers to the scene.
As Chicago prepares for what is expected to be another round of protests.
This morning, authorities in Chicago remain on high alert following moments of heated protests outside the Democratic National Convention.
Okay, those police officers, that security, they are going to be on high alert. What does that mean? Being ready and watching carefully for danger or trouble. Security was on high alert due to rumors of more protesters arriving at the DNC. Remember when we talked about tense exchanges? They also talk about heated exchanges. And when you think of heated in English, you might think warm or hot. Where I live, it gets very cold in the winter, and some people have heated garages. It's a garage where you can keep your car, but you can also turn on the heat. Some people also have heated pools where I live. Yeah, you can actually warm up a pool. But heated can also mean when people become very angry or emotional. You can imagine those protesters, they feel very passionate about their cause. They are talking about people dying. So they're going to be very emotional. Their emotions are going to be running high. Let's take a look at a sentence using heated in that way. A heated argument broke out between the police and the protesters about their rights. You do have the right to protest. It's not illegal to do that in this country, but you can't damage property and you can't hurt people. So those protests yesterday got a little violent. The police had to do something about it.
This morning, authorities in Chicago remain on high alert following moments of heated protests outside the Democratic National Convention. Multiple people detained and arrested, some carried away after a group broke through a layer of Secret Service fencing.
Detained. Let's talk about what detained means. Being stopped and held by the police or authorities, like people in charge. Now, arrested would mean that person went to jail, they were put in handcuffs, like the woman in the picture is. But detained doesn't mean you go to jail. You might later, but detained just means the police are not letting you leave. Let's look at a sentence with detained. Several protesters were detained after they refused to leave the restricted area. And a restricted area is a place where people are not allowed to go. Phrasal verb here, carried away. Let's talk about one way we use carried away in English, and it is different from the way the reporter used it. Let's look at the definition. When someone becomes overly excited or emotional and loses control. Maybe you are at a concert listening to some music you really like. Well, you could get carried away. You could get very emotional, start shouting, screaming. It can be a good thing or it can be a bad thing. Maybe you are having an argument with a person, and if you get carried away, that means you have like too much emotion. There is the sentence right down there. Some protesters got carried away and started pushing against the police lines. But the reporter didn't use it as a phrasal verb. Literally, that person is being carried by the police. The police are taking that person to another area. It's not a phrasal verb here. That person is literally being carried away, probably to jail. Secret Service, I have mentioned them before when I did the English lesson about the attempted assassination on former President Trump. Let's look at it again. A group responsible for protecting important government officials. And here is a sentence. The Secret Service surrounded the DNC building to protect key political figures. I will leave a link to the English lesson I did before about the DNC, and there I talk about 2 different ways we use key in English. Also, would you mind hitting that like button so other people can find this English lesson? And if this is your first time here, don't be afraid to subscribe so you never miss another English lesson.
Multiple people detained and arrested, some carried away after a group broke through a layer of Secret Service fencing. The DNC Joint Information Center writing, "At no point was the inner perimeter breached and there was no threat to any protectees." Overnight, demonstrators even seen inside the convention center. One group unraveling a protest banner in support of Palestinians during President Biden's speech, with other attendees quickly placing their own signs in front of them.
Okay, the next two terms, protectee and attendee, they both have the same ending. They both have the same suffix. So let's talk about them together. What are protectees? Those are people being protected by security, like Secret Service. In this case, the Secret Service are the protectors and the political figures are the protectees. They are the people being protected. Here's a sentence. The protectees were safely escorted into the building despite the large crowd of protesters. And attendees are people who attend something. People who go to an event like a meeting, conference, or convention. Even in the picture, you can see this woman is probably at a concert. She could be at a conference, but she is an attendee. She is a person who is attending something. Here's a sentence. The attendees at the DNC had to pass through several security checks due to the protests. I don't know if you remember, but at one time on this channel, I interviewed Bob the Canadian. Great guy. Give him a follow if you don't know him, another English teacher. But when I interviewed him, I was the interviewer. He was the interviewee. He was the person being interviewed.
Thousands rallying and marching Monday afternoon, at one point delaying some buses carrying convention delegates, a DNC official tells NBC News.
Felt like I needed to be around like-minded people.
In the news report, they mentioned that buses were being delayed. What does that mean? Causing something to take longer or happen later than planned. If you have ever flown on an airplane, there's a good chance that your plane was delayed. It took a little longer for you to take off in your airplane. The protesters were delaying the start of the DNC by blocking the main roads. The woman being interviewed, or the interviewee, she mentioned like-minded people. What does that mean? Like-minded people. Those are people who share the same opinions or beliefs, who feel the same way that you do. If you attend an English class, you are there to improve your English. In the class, there are probably like-minded people, other people who also want to improve their English. I'm hoping that people who are watching me right now are like-minded people. They all want to improve their English here. Let's look at a sentence using like-minded people. The protesters were like-minded people who all wanted the same changes from the DNC.
Thousands rallying and marching Monday afternoon, at one point delaying some buses carrying convention delegates, a DNC official tells NBC News.
Felt like I needed to be around like-minded people.
And Chicago's top cop overnight is praising his officers, saying that the de-escalation training that they received ahead of the convention came to good use. That situation resolved with no tear gas, no batons being used.
De-escalation. I've talked about escalation before on this channel. It means like to rise up. You could take an escalator at an airport, and that would bring you to another floor. On an escalator, you could go up or down. De-escalation always means down, like calmer. And if you look at that picture, that woman seems very calm. But what is de-escalation? The reporter talked about de-escalation tactics that the police used. Actions taken to reduce tension or calm a situation down. If the protesters were angry and the police got even angrier, that would escalate the situation. It seems the police have been trained on how to bring the tension down, how to make people feel less angry. The police used de-escalation techniques to prevent the crowd from becoming violent. Oh boy, tear gas. Luckily, the police did not have to use tear gas yesterday, but what is it? Take a look at the picture. A chemical used by police that makes people's eyes sting and tear up. You probably know that the water from your eyes when you cry, it's called tears. Hang on, I need to put the microphone down and I'm going to tear some paper. I'm not sure the first time I tore the paper, I don't know if you could see that. So I did it again. I tore the paper twice. But tear and tear are spelled the exact same way. It can be pretty confusing. The police had to use tear gas when some of the protesters became aggressive. Luckily, that example sentence is not true. They also did not have to use their batons. What is that? Short, heavy sticks carried by police, often used for crowd control. So if people get a little too angry, a little too emotional, the police might have to use their batons. I guess it's better than using a gun. The police held their batons, but did not use them unless a protester got too close. Luckily, the tear gas and the batons have not been used yet. Hopefully, they are not used at all. I hope you have enjoyed this English lesson about the DNC and the angry protests that are there. If you're looking for more information about the DNC, I left an English lesson there for you. Thanks so much for watching. See you next time.